She was strung up like prey left for the vultures, her wrists and ankles stretched wide by coarse hemp rope that bit deep into her skin. Her blouse ripped at the shoulder, hanging in tatters, her face smeared with dirt, sweat, and something that looked a lot like surrender. And the high noon sun of Abilene, Kansas, burned down on her exposed skin until it turned raw and red, blistering at the edges. Violet Hayes was barely 21, and she had stopped trying to scream an hour ago. Now, only a dry rasp escaped her cracked lips every time the rope dug deeper into her shoulders, every time her body sagged forward and the bindings caught her full weight. She had been left in the middle of the Kansas grasslands, left to bake, left to break under the merciless prairie sun. A hot wind swept across the endless sea of buffalo grass. No relief came with it, just more heat, more dust, more pain. The wooden cross frame that held her suspended groaned with each gust as if complaining about her weight, as if the structure itself resented being part of this cruelty. Her toes barely touched the ground, just enough to keep her from choking, but not enough to give her any real relief. Every heartbeat felt like it might be her last. She had not been strung up all morning, but 3 hours in that merciless sun felt close enough to eternity, close enough to hell itself. Violet had known she would pay for stealing from Marshal Cade Brennan. She just never imagined payment would look like this. Never imagined the law would leave her hanging in the open prairie like a warning sign, like something less than human. She thought she would rot in a cell, maybe get a trial, maybe even hang properly if it came to that. Not be displayed like a scarecrow for anyone who dared to cross the law of Abilene. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps that burned her throat. Then came the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, steady, approaching from beyond the rolling hills with the lazy rhythm of a man who had no clue he was riding straight into another person's nightmare. Thomas Mercer, folks called him Tom, appeared through the heat shimmer like something out of a fever dream. A cattle rancher in his mid-40s with a weathered face that told stories of hard winters and harder choices. Sun-damaged skin, steady gray eyes, broad shoulders that carried the weight of running a ranch alone. A man who had weathered storms both on the range and in the depths of the human soul, who had buried a wife 5 years back and never quite figured out how to fill the silence she left behind. He pulled his bay stallion to a dead stop, his gaze locking onto the figure hanging in the sun like a broken doll. Shock flashed across his weathered face, then raw rage, then something far quieter, something that looked a lot like grief. He dismounted fast, boots hitting the ground hard. Violet lifted her head, with what little strength remained, her vision blurry, her mind barely holding on. She thought he was here to finish what Marshal Brennan started, thought maybe the marshal had sent him to make sure she didn't survive the day. Her voice came out broken, like something already halfway buried. "Please don't," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. Tom froze, not because of her words, but because of the way she said them, as if she had already accepted that mercy was not meant for girls like her, as if she had already made peace with dying out here alone. He reached for the ropes without a word. She flinched hard, her whole body jerking away, even though she had nowhere to go. He didn't stop, didn't slow down. He examined every knot with the careful attention of a man who knew rope work. Every bruise that darkened her skin, every wound carved into her body by hours of hanging in the sun. And in that moment, standing there in the brutal heat with this girl barely clinging to life, Tom Mercer knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever crime this girl had committed, whatever she had done to end up here, nothing, absolutely nothing, could justify this. His hand closed around the handle of his knife, the worn leather grip familiar in his palm. The prairie went silent except for the wind. The sun burned hotter, pressing down like a weight, and Violet Hayes hung between life and death, between hope and surrender. While a rancher she had never met, whose name she didn't even know, made a choice that would alter both of their lives forever. If Tom Mercer cuts her down, will the law hunt him next and bury them both before the truth ever sees sunlight? The knife flashed once in the brutal light, the blade catching the sun. Then Tom Mercer cut the rope with one clean stroke. Violet dropped like a stone, her legs giving out completely. He caught her halfway down, her weight slamming into his chest hard enough to knock the air from his lungs and make him stagger back a step. She gasped, oxygen tearing into her throat like broken glass, her whole body convulsing with the shock of breathing freely again. Her legs buckled completely. Bones turned to water. If he had arrived 5 minutes later, maybe 10, she would already be gone. Just another body left to rot in the Kansas sun. Tom slid one arm behind her back, another under her knees, and lifted her carefully. She was light, far too light for a girl her age, like she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. He carried her like he would a wounded foal, cradling her against his chest as he walked away from that cursed frame, away from that monument to cruelty. He set her down in the shade of a scrubby cottonwood tree, the only cover for miles, and pulled his canteen from his saddle. He gave her water in slow, careful sips, tilting the canteen just enough, knowing that too much too fast would make her sick. He waited until her eyes could focus again, until the glassy look faded and she could actually see him, before he even considered putting her on a horse. Up close, in the dappled shade, she didn't look like a criminal at all, just a terrified kid with a stubborn chin, sharp cheekbones that stood out too much, and dark eyes that refused to stay shut even though exhaustion pulled at her like an anchor. Dried blood crusted the corners of her mouth. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rope had cut deep. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "I stole from him," she whispered hoarsely, each word an effort. "From Marshal Brennan. I broke into his office late one night, cracked open his lockbox with a crowbar I found in the stable, took his money, every dollar that was in there." Tom didn't respond right away, just kept giving her water, kept checking her pulse at her wrist to make sure she was stable. Her confession settled in his chest like a lead weight, so she really was a thief. The marshal had not lied about that part, at least. Whatever else was going on here, she had committed a crime. He lifted her gently into the saddle after a few more minutes, waiting until she nodded that she was ready, then swung up behind her so she wouldn't tumble off. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her body going limp now that someone else was holding her up. The horse started moving at a steady walk, not too fast, just enough to cover ground. He could feel every shiver that ran through her thin frame, every tremor that shook her as the adrenaline wore off and the pain settled in deep. "You know he had every right to throw you in a cell," Tom said quietly after they had ridden for a while, his voice low and even. "Lock you up, bring you before the judge. That's what the law says." "A cell?" she answered, her voice raw as sandpaper, rough as gravel. "Not a rope in the middle of nowhere, not leaving me to die like that." That shut him up for a good long while, because she was right and he knew it. They followed the Smoky Hill River as it wound through the grasslands, the water glinting gold and silver in the afternoon light. Tom kept his eyes on the trail ahead, scanning for trouble, but his mind was a hurricane of thoughts spinning in circles. He respected the law, always had. This land turned savage without it, turned into a place where might made right and the weak got trampled. Yet what he had just witnessed didn't feel like law at all. It felt like cruelty dressed up in a badge, like punishment that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power. By the time they reached the low hills where his ranch sat, the sun was sinking fast toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The modest house came into view as they crested the final rise. One porch that wrapped around the front, one stone chimney that rose from the center. Smoke drifting lazy from the top where the breakfast fire had died down to coals. Tom carried Violet inside, shouldering open the door and laying her carefully on his own bed. The quilt his late wife had stitched still covering the mattress. He poured water into a tin basin, ripped an old work shirt into strips, and began cleaning the rope burns on her wrists and ankles with gentle, practiced movements. She winced with each touch, but didn't pull away, just gritted her teeth and stared at the ceiling. "Tomorrow, I'm taking you back into town," he said finally, not looking at her as he worked. "You stole. You answer for that. That's how it has to be. But in front of a judge, not hanging like a trophy, in a courtroom where you get to speak, where the law actually means something." Violet stared at the rough wooden ceiling, at the exposed beams that ran across it. There was something else pressing behind her eyes. Something heavy and dark, something darker than simple theft, bigger than just stealing money. But she swallowed it down hard, forced it back. Why tell this stranger that she had seen Marshal Brennan do something far worse than anything she had done herself? Why drag him deeper into this mess when he had already risked enough just by cutting her down? For tonight, she would just be a thief who got lucky, who ran into a decent man at the right moment. Tom would just be a rancher who couldn't walk past suffering, who had a conscience that wouldn't let him leave her there. Outside, the Kansas sky turned deep crimson and burnt orange as the sun dropped below the horizon. The temperature started to fall as night crept in. And somewhere far off, back toward Abilene, a lone rider started asking questions about the girl who had vanished from his rope, about the rancher who had dared to interfere. When that rider reaches this ranch, whose side will Tom Mercer stand on? Morning on the Mercer ranch started quiet, almost peaceful. Too quiet for what was coming. Tom was awake before dawn like always, like he had been every day for 20 years. He fed the cattle in the near pasture, checked the water troughs to make sure the pump was working, mended a section of fence that had come loose in the wind. He tried very hard not to glance at the bedroom door where Violet was sleeping in his bed while he had taken the old cot by the kitchen stove, the same cot he used to give his ranch hands when they worked the fall roundup. He told himself this was straightforward, simple even. He would take her back into town after breakfast. He would stand beside her in front of the circuit judge who came through twice a month. The law would do what the law was meant to do, what it was supposed to do in a civilized society. No more ropes in the middle of the grasslands. No more cruelty masquerading as justice. The tidy little plan lasted right up until he heard horses thundering fast up the dirt lane, moving at a full gallop. Not a wagon bringing supplies, not a neighbor stopping by to talk cattle prices. 3 riders, one violent rhythm that shook the ground. Tom stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his work trousers, his gut already tightening with tension. Marshal Cade Brennan reined in hard at the gate, with 2 deputies flanking him like dogs at heel. Dust billowing up around all 3 horses in a thick cloud, their flanks heaving with exertion. Those cold gray eyes swept the house first, then the barn, then the fresh tracks in the dirt that led right to Tom's door. Then they locked onto Tom with the focus of a predator that had found its prey. "Morning, Mercer," the marshal said, his voice carrying across the yard. He smiled, but it never touched his eyes, never reached anywhere near genuine. "Seems somebody cut down my prisoner last night, interfered with the law." Tom felt the lie rising in his throat, felt the urge to deny everything, to play dumb. But the lie died halfway up, withered before it could take shape, so he settled for the truth. "I found a girl hanging where buzzards were already circling," Tom said steadily, meeting the marshal's gaze without flinching. "I brought her here so she didn't die like an animal left in a trap." "You interfered with legal punishment," Brennan said flatly, his voice hard as iron now. "She was being disciplined according to territorial law. She belongs in my jail, and you're going to hand her over right now." The smile vanished completely. Tom shook his head slowly, deliberately. "She belongs in a courtroom, in front of a judge. What you did out there wasn't justice, wasn't even close. That was torture, plain and simple." For a long second, they just stared at each other across the dusty yard. Old rancher on the porch with calloused hands and a clear conscience. Man with a badge in the yard, with a gun on his hip and something ugly in his eyes. The kind of standoff that decides what kind of men they really are, what they're willing to do when the stakes get high. Inside the house, Violet stood barefoot just behind the door, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Every muscle coiled tight, ready to run, even though she had nowhere to go. She could hear every word through the thin walls, She knew that voice, would know it anywhere. She could still feel the bite of his rope, still taste the dust and fear. If he dragged her back to Abilene, there would be no trial, no second chance, no mercy. Just one more ride into the heat and a shallow grave somewhere out past town, where no one would bother to mark it, where the coyotes would scatter her bones before anyone even noticed she was gone. Her hands started shaking. Her mouth went bone dry. She gripped the door frame to steady herself, her knuckles turning white, then slipped quietly into the kitchen as the men continued to argue outside, their voices rising and falling like a storm building on the horizon. When Tom finally stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind him, his jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful, the muscles jumping under his skin. "He wants you back," Tom said, his voice rough. "Says the rope was legal punishment. Says I had no right to interfere." Words already spreading through Abilene that Tom Mercer cut down the thief who robbed the marshal. "Some folks are calling me a fool who doesn't understand how the law works. But most are saying the marshal got shamed in front of the whole town, that he looks weak now." Violet looked at him then. Really looked at him for the first time since he had carried her inside. This man had risked himself once already just by cutting her down, had put himself in the marshal's crosshairs. If she kept silent now, if she let him take her back without knowing the whole truth, he would walk right back into the marshal's trap with her. They would both end up dead or worse. But if she told the truth, if she opened her mouth and let it all spill out, both of them might never see another sunrise. The marshal would make sure of that. Her voice came out in a hoarse whisper, barely more than a breath. "Tom, I did steal. That part is true. But I stole the wrong thing. I took money that was never his to keep, money that had blood on it. And I saw what he did to the man it belonged to. Saw the whole thing happen." Tom stared at her hard, his gray eyes searching her face for any sign of deception. "What did you see, Violet? Don't dance around it. Tell me straight." She took a breath that shook her entire body from head to toe, her hands trembling. Because once she answered that question, once the words left her mouth, there would be no going back for either of them. The path forward would be set, and it would be dangerous. Before we follow Tom and Violet down this dangerous trail, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And while you're here, grab your coffee or tea and tell me in the comments what time it is right now and where you're listening from. Violet didn't look at Tom when she finally answered. She stared at the warm floorboards like the truth was carved there in the wood grain, like she could read it if she looked hard enough. "I was cleaning the marshal's office," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the small room. "Late, after midnight. He thought I'd gone home hours before, thought the building was empty." Her hands twisted in her torn skirt, wringing the fabric. "I heard a man come in through the front door. Not a soldier from the fort, just a trail-worn fellow in a dusty coat with a Union Pacific Railroad badge pinned to his vest. He had a leather courier bag slung over his shoulder, the kind they use for payroll runs. They argued," she continued, her voice getting stronger now. "Argued about money, about cash that was supposed to reach the railroad office in Topeka and never arrived. The courier was accusing the marshal of taking it, said he had proof, said he was going to report it to the territorial governor. The marshal kept denying it, kept saying the courier was mistaken, that the money must have been lost somewhere else along the line. Tom said nothing, just listened. He could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. "Then I heard the gunshot," Violet whispered. And now her voice broke just a little. Just one, clean and final. The courier hit the floor like a sack of grain. I was hiding in the closet where the brooms are kept, watching through a crack in the door. Marshal Brennan stood there with smoke rising off his revolver like it was nothing at all, like he had just swatted a fly. She swallowed hard, her throat working. He wrapped the body in a canvas tarp, tied it with rope, loaded it in a wagon that was sitting out back. I watched him drive out past the last houses in town, headed south toward a ravine near Mud Creek where folks don't go much anymore, where the ground is too rocky for farming and too steep for cattle. That leather bag, the one with the Union Pacific seal on it, ended up in his lockbox. Same lockbox I cracked open 2 weeks later. I thought I was just robbing a crooked lawman, someone who had been skimming money from fines and fees. Turns out I stole from a grave, took money that a dead man was supposed to deliver. Silence settled thick in the room, like fog rolling in off the river. Tom had seen bad men in his life, had dealt with his share of trouble. Rustlers who would cut your throat for a good horse, claim jumpers who would shoot you for your land, drifters with blood on their hands and lies on their tongues. But a lawman killing a courier for money, then stringing up a girl to bury the truth, to make sure she could never tell anyone what she had seen. That was something else entirely. That was evil wearing a badge. "If we stay here," Violet said quietly, looking up at him now with those dark eyes, "he'll come back. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But he'll come back with a rope and a story. And only one of those will be true. He'll say I attacked him, or I tried to escape, or I pulled a weapon. And by the time anyone asks questions, we'll both be dead and buried, where no one will ever find us." Tom rubbed his weathered face with both hands, feeling the rough stubble, the deep lines that years of sun and wind had carved. Then he looked toward the window where the marshal had ridden in, where dust still hung in the air. "Fort Riley," he said quietly, thinking it through as he spoke. "Soldiers there know the railroad men, have regular contact with them. They'll care if a Union Pacific courier and his payroll bag went missing. And the marshal doesn't own their loyalty, can't buy them off or threaten them the way he does the folks in Abilene." By the time the sun touched the horizon, they were in the saddle and moving. Tom tied a small bedroll behind his bay stallion, checked his rifle, made sure his canteen was full. He tucked the stolen courier bag deep under his long coat, where it wouldn't be visible. Then he helped Violet up in front of him, lifting her carefully because she still moved like every step hurt, like the rope burns and bruises, went bone deep. She settled into the saddle, and he swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. "If we do this," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "there's no going back. We're committing to this path all the way." "There was no going back the moment I cut you down," Tom answered, and he meant it. They followed the Smoky Hill River northwest, the water running silver in the fading light, this time not at a walk, but at a hard, urgent gallop that ate up the miles. They pushed the horse as fast as they dared without running it into the ground. Behind them, maybe an hour back, maybe less, on the ridge overlooking the Mercer ranch, Marshal Cade Brennan sat on his horse and watched two tiny figures riding northwest through the twilight. Dust streaming up behind them like a banner. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. His two deputies shifted nervously in their saddles beside him, waiting for orders, waiting to be told what to do. He didn't need a spyglass to understand what was happening, where they were headed. If they reached Fort Riley, if they got inside those walls and started talking to the soldiers, his carefully constructed life would come crashing down around him. The money, the reputation, the power, all of it would be finished. His whole life would be finished. He spurred his horse so hard it screamed in pain and reared up, and he motioned sharply for one deputy to ride with him while the other circled back toward town to spread whatever story would serve them best. 3 guns chasing one rancher and one girl who knew far too much, who had seen too much, who could destroy everything with just a few words spoken to the right people. Night began to fall across the Kansas prairie as Tom and Violet pushed harder, the horses' sides heaving with effort. They saw the first lanterns of Fort Riley flickering in the distance, like beacons, like hope itself made visible. But hoofbeats thundered closer behind them, closing the distance fast, relentless. If the soldiers at that gate believed the marshal before they believe a thief and an old rancher, what do you think happens on that dark road next? At the edge of Fort Riley, a sentry stepped forward from his post with his rifle raised to his shoulder. "Ready!" He shouted for them to halt, his voice sharp and commanding, the voice of a man who had been trained to stop threats. Tom hauled on the reins so hard the stallion slid in the dirt, its hooves throwing up rocks and dust as it fought to stop. Violet almost slipped from the saddle, would have fallen if Tom hadn't tightened his grip around her waist. The sentry didn't care who they were or what their story was. He cared that it was nearly full dark and 3 riders were making a racket at his post, that something about this situation felt wrong. Marshal Brennan arrived a heartbeat later, his horse's hooves pounding the ground like thunder. 2 deputies materialized behind him, all 3 horses lathered with foam and sweat, their sides heaving. His badge caught the light from the fort's lanterns, glinting like a threat. Everybody started talking at once, voices overlapping in chaos. The marshal waving his badge and barking orders, demanding they arrest Tom and Violet immediately. Tom holding up his empty hands, trying to explain. Violet barely clinging to the saddle horn, her strength nearly gone. The sentry did exactly what a good soldier does when faced with chaos. He shut the gate with a heavy iron clang. He separated them, putting physical distance between the groups, and he sent a runner to fetch an officer, someone with the authority to sort this mess out. "That girl is a fugitive thief," Marshal Brennan snapped, his voice carrying across the yard. "She broke into my office, cracked my lockbox, stole territorial funds. The old man is harboring her, interfering with the law. I'm here to bring her back to Abilene to face justice in my jail." Maybe that would have worked any other day, any other time. But Tom Mercer had not ridden all this way, had not risked everything, just to stay quiet now. He slid off the horse, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his lungs burning from the hard ride. He pulled the heavy leather courier bag from under his coat with both hands. He walked forward slowly, carefully, and tossed it at the soldier's boots, where it landed with a heavy thud. "That's Union Pacific Railroad money," Tom said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "Their courier never made it to the railroad office in Topeka. He never made it anywhere. She saw why. She saw what happened to him." Every eye in the yard turned to Violet, the moment stretching out long and tense. She could have stayed silent right then, could have let Tom take the lead, could have melted back into the shadows and let her chance die right there in that dusty fort yard. Instead, she slid down from the saddle, her legs barely holding her, and stood beside Tom. She lifted her chin and met the officer's gaze directly. Her voice shook at first, but it didn't break, didn't falter. She told them everything. About cleaning the marshal's office late at night, about the gunshot she heard through the thin walls, about the Union Pacific courier hitting the floor with a bullet in his chest, about the body wrapped in canvas and hauled out of town in a wagon toward a lonely ravine near Mud Creek where the ground was too rocky to farm, about the leather bag that ended up in the marshal's lockbox, the same bag that now sat at the soldier's feet. The officer, a captain with gray in his beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing, didn't rush to judgment. He let her speak without interruption. He let Tom add his piece. Then he had statements taken from everyone, questions asked and answered, names and dates written down in careful script. A telegram was sent down the line to Union Pacific headquarters in Omaha to ask if a courier had gone missing on the Abilene to Topeka route, if any payroll bags had failed to arrive. For the next 3 days, Tom and Violet were kept inside Fort Riley. Not as prisoners in the stockade, but not exactly free to leave either. They were given a small room in the guest quarters, given food and water, given time to rest and recover. They answered the same questions multiple times from different officers, each one probing for inconsistencies, for any sign that the story was fabricated. The story never changed, not one detail shifted. When word came back on the 4th day that a Union Pacific courier named Henry Walsh and his payroll delivery had vanished 6 weeks earlier, that the railroad had been investigating but had no leads, the captain's face went hard as stone. He sent 12 armed cavalry soldiers to Abilene with Tom and Violet, riding along under full military escort. Men like that don't forget the dead, don't forgive murder. Faces hardened with purpose, rifles lifted and ready. And for the first time in a very long time, Marshal Cade Brennan found himself staring down rifle barrels that were not on his side, that he could not control or manipulate. They rode back to Abilene in force, a column of blue uniforms and gleaming rifles. They brought a federal investigator from the fort, a man whose authority superseded any territorial lawman. They rode straight to the ravine near Mud Creek, where Violet said to dig, where she had watched the marshal's wagon disappear into the darkness that night. They dug in the rocky ground with shovels and picks, soldiers working in shifts. They found bones half buried in the shallow earth, scraps of cloth that had once been a coat, buttons stamped with initials. And most damning of all, a small metal badge engraved with the Union Pacific Railroad seal, and the name Henry Walsh that matched perfectly with a missing courier from their records. Cade Brennan was not dragged to the gallows the next morning in some act of frontier justice. He was arrested properly, with witnesses and documentation. He was transported east under heavy military guard, locked in irons in the back of a prison wagon. 3 months later, he stood in a federal courtroom in Topeka and faced a judge who didn't owe him any favors, who had no stake in protecting a corrupt lawman. The evidence was presented methodically. Violet's testimony, Tom's account, the recovered body and badge, the stolen money. The verdict came back guilty on all counts: murder, theft, abuse of authority. The sentence came back swift and final: hanging. As for Tom and Violet, they rode home together after the trial, after they had given their final statements and been released. Not as outlaw and captor, not as criminal and lawman, but as two people who had walked through the same fire together and somehow come out standing on the other side. Violet worked the Mercer ranch through that summer and into fall, working to repay what she had stolen from the courier bag and a little more besides. She learned to tie ropes for breaking colts, not for punishment or torture. She learned to mend fences that ran for miles across the prairie, to brand cattle with a steady hand, to read the sky for coming storms, and know when to bring the herd in close. On quiet evenings, as the workday ended and the sun began its descent, she and Tom sat on the porch in old wooden chairs that creaked with age. They watched the Kansas sky fade from brilliant gold to deep purple to star-filled black. They said very little, needing even less, the silence between them comfortable and easy. Months turned into seasons without either of them quite noticing. Winter came with its bitter winds and snow that covered the prairie in white. They worked together to keep the cattle fed, to break ice in the water troughs, to keep the fires burning. Spring brought wildflowers across the grasslands, carpets of color that stretched to the horizon. And somewhere in all that quiet time, in all those shared meals and long days of work, something shifted between them. It wasn't loud or dramatic, no grand declarations or sweeping gestures. Just a slow, steady knowing that grew like roots going deep. Neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. Neither of them could imagine going back to the loneliness they had known before. One evening in early summer, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in shades of orange and gold, Tom looked over at Violet. She was mending a saddle strap with careful stitches, her fingers nimble and sure. "You planning to stay?" he asked quietly. Violet didn't look up from her work, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You planning to ask me to?" Tom leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and considered his words carefully. "I don't have much to offer, just a ranch that needs constant work, some cattle that are more stubborn than smart, and a man set in his ways who's probably too old to change much." "Sounds about right," she said quietly, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "Sounds like exactly enough." And that was that. No rope waiting in the darkness. No running from shadows. No fear of what tomorrow might bring. Just two people who had saved each other when it mattered most, who had chosen to stand together when staying apart would have been easier and safer. Maybe that's the real heart of this story, the truth that sits at the center of it all. Sometimes justice only happens because one stubborn soul refuses to look away from someone else's pain, refuses to accept that cruelty is just the way things are. Sometimes the person everyone calls a thief, the one everyone has already judged and condemned, is the only one brave enough to tell the truth when it matters most. And sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fireworks or dramatic speeches. It just quietly shows up in the space between survival and hope, between yesterday's wounds and tomorrow's possibilities, and makes itself at home. If if you had ridden past that wooden frame that day, if you had seen Violet hanging there in the sun, would you have cut her down knowing trouble would come hunting you next? Have you ever seen something wrong, something that made your stomach turn, and had to decide whether to stay quiet and safe or stand up and risk everything? If this story stirred something in you, if it made you feel something real, tap that like button so more folks can find it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next ride out into the Old West with us. The next story of courage and justice and people who refuse to give up. And before you go, pour yourself another cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and tell me in the comments what time it is right now, where you are and where you're listening from. I want to know where this story found you today.